Here we go. And we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery with our live virtual studio audience, and to all those watching, the millions watching on YouTube. It is wonderful to have you with us. As tonight we start with chapter 1 of Masechet Meilah. That is not to be confused with Masechet Meilah, which does not exist, and would, if it did exist, would talk about Brit Mila. This is Meilah, Mem Ayin Yud Lamed Hey, which talks about people who misuse temple property. So that's the topic of the next 6 chapters, and we might be able to do 3 of them tonight. We're going to have to see. So we are talking about the halachot regarding property of the Beit HaMikdash, which gets misused, which gets misappropriated. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to have to try and bear in mind. If a person did this by accident, either they thought that it wasn't temple property, or they knew it was temple property, but they didn't know that they weren't allowed to use it for their own personal benefit. So if they did that by accident, then they're going to be fined. How much are they going to be fined? They're going to be fined what is known as keren v'chomesh. They're going to have to pay back the value of the item that they have mishandled, and they're going to have to pay back an additional fifth on top of that, which is really an additional 25%. But the sum total of those 5 25% turns it into 5 portions, which is why it's known as keren v'chomesh, because we're adding on 25%, but that means it's now 125%, which is comprised of 5/5. So that is the penalty, the fine that they're going to have to pay back, and they are going to have to bring a korban asham. They're going to have to bring a guilt offering, which would be a ram, and it would have to be worth at least 2 silver shekalim. And for all those who were on last week's share, I think we kind of mentioned that in passing. So broadly speaking, there's 3 kinds of categories when it comes to Meilah, when it comes to this misappropriated, mishandled temple items. It can be something that has been dedicated to the temple coffers, and so for the entire time that it has that sanctity infused in it, the entire time that it is consecrated, it is going to be subject to this Meilah. Or it could be sacrifices. It could be the high-level sacrifices. It could be Kodshei Kodshim that have been dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash. Or it could be Kodshei Kalim. It could be the lighter sanctity, the lighter holiness sacrifices. And the fundamental difference between the higher level and the lower level is that no one's going to be eating the higher level sacrifices. None of those portions get divided up amongst people. And so from the point that they get dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash, the whole animal is going to be subject to Meilah. Although after the sprinkling, there might be parts that go to the Kohanim. And if they are going to the Kohanim, then those parts are going to be exempted from Meilah. But with a lower level sanctity sacrifice, from the moment that they get dedicated, they're not going to be subjected to Meilah if it's going to end up in the hands of the owner. And it's only other parts that get dedicated to the altar which are going to be subject to Meilah. So those are like the primary differences. Things that are going to maintain a connection to the altar, things which are going to maintain a connection to the Beis HaMikdash, things which are going to continue to have high levels of sanctity, those are things which are going to be subject to Meilah. And we're going to see that throughout the Mishnah, it's going to constantly say Mo'alin Bahen or Ein Mo'alin Bahen. Either it's subject to Meilah, which means you're not allowed to use it, or Ein Mo'alin Bahen, or it's not subject to Meilah, and these things would be allowed to be used for your benefit. So with that in mind, let's turn to chapter 1, and hopefully things may start to become a little bit clearer. Let's get the words up on the screen for you there. I assume everyone can see it. I assume it's relatively clear. So here we go with chapter 1, Perek Aleph of Maseches Meilah. So we're going to be starting by talking about Kodshei Kodshim, the higher level sacrifices. and they get slaughtered normally on the north side of the altar. Now, if they were to be slaughtered on the south side of the altar, then they're going to be invalid. And we had said that high-level sacrifices are going to, from the moment they get consecrated, dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash, they are going to be subject to Meilah. But that is assuming that it's going to be a valid sacrifice from start to finish. Because if the sacrifice never made it to the part of the process where the blood gets sprinkled, if you remember, there's 4 stages. There's the shechita, there's the slaughter, then they collect the blood, transport the blood, and sprinkle the blood. If it never gets to the point where the blood is going to be sprinkled, then that korban is going to remain subject to Meilah forever. They're never going to be able to have any benefit from it whatsoever. Otherwise, they violate this mitzvah of Meilah. So the Mishnah says, Kodshe kodshim sheshachatan badarom mo'alin bahem. If a high-level sacrifice gets slaughtered in the south side, which would invalidate it, so you're not going to be doing the rest of the process to sprinkle the blood on the altar, so then it's going to be subject to Meilah the entire time. Shachatan b'darom, if they slaughtered it in the south, v'kibel daman batzafon, but they collected the blood in the north, which is where it should have been killed in the first place. Batzafon v'kibel daman b'daram, or it got slaughtered in the north, which was the right place, but they collected the blood in the south. Shechatan bayom v'zarak balayla, or they slaughtered it in the day in the right place, but they sprinkled it at night, which is the wrong time to be doing that part of the process. Or balayla, they slaughtered it at night, which is the wrong time and invalidates it. V'zarak bayom, and they sprinkled it in the day, the right time. Or shechatan chutz lizmanan v'chutz limukoman. Or, as you recall from right at the beginning of this Seder Kodshim, they slaughtered it with the wrong intentions in their mind. They slaughtered it with the intention to eat it after its permitted time, or to eat it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. In all of these instances, where the korban has become invalidated and there's no way that you're going to be able to process the sacrifice anymore, so then, mo'alin bahem, it's going to be subject to Meilah. You can't use it for anything and you can't benefit, you can't eat it, you can't do anything with it because it's subject to Meilah. It never had the process done, which would have meant that parts of that sacrifice would be permitted, right? So there might be pieces of meat that get given to the Kohanim, right? So why are they not violating Meilah? Because those things are allowed after a certain point. But if you can never get to that point, then it's always going to be subject to Meilah. That's the first position in the Mishnah. Klal Omar Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua said a klal, a principle about Meilah. Kol shahaya la sha'as heter la kohanim ein mo'alin ba. Rabbi Yehoshua says as follows, that the litmus test is whether there's ever going to be a point when the kohanim can eat the korban. If they're allowed at any point to eat the flesh, then it's not going to be subject to Meilah. But if they're never going to get hold of that sacrifice, then Meilah will remain with it forever. If it's never going to have any pieces, any parts, any period of fitness where the Kohanim can benefit, can eat it, then it's going to be subject to Meilah. Says the Mishnah, Ezohi shahaya la shas heter la kohanim. When is it going to be that it had a period of fitness where it could have been eaten by the Kohanim? So fundamentally, it's going to be instances where the process was done correctly. It was slaughtered in the right place, the blood was sprinkled in the right place. But the times where you're not going to be able to have it any longer, but it was once permitted, is the examples that the Mishnah brings is shelana, where it was left overnight. So the sprinkling was kosher. They could have eaten it, but it was left overnight, so they're not allowed it anymore. Or v'shenitma'a, or it was, at one point, it was completely legitimate, ready for the Kohanim, but it became contaminated after that. Or v'sheyatzar, or it came out of the confines of the Beis HaMikdash, and so they weren't allowed to do anything with it anymore, but there was a time where it was permitted. And ezohi shelo haya la shas heter kohanim. So what's the examples of a sacrifice which would have never had a period where the Kohanim could eat the pieces that they were entitled to. Shenishchata chutz lizmana chutz limkoma. It's where they had the wrong intention, that they were going to eat it or sprinkle it at the wrong time, or that they were going to do it in the wrong place, or v'shekiblu pasulim, or the wrong people were handling the korban. Right? It didn't go to a pure kohen. It went to an impure kohen. It went to a non-kohen, whatever it might be. It went to the wrong person. V'zarku es daman, and they went and sprinkled the blood. So if there were disqualifications that happened to this korban before it got eaten, then these things are going to remain consecrated, and you're not going to be allowed to have any benefit, and you'll be violating Meilah if you do. Let's move on to Mishnah Base, where we're continuing to discuss the high-level sacrifices. So in this Mishnah, we're going to have done the avodah, we're going to have done the process perfectly, but something's going to have happened in the interim. We're going to see that the meat was taken outside of the temple courtyard. That's a big no-no. That's a big problem for us. So if that happened after they did the sprinkling, right? So it was going to be allowed for the Kohanim. The meat would have been allowed to the Kohanim. And so Meilah vanishes from that meat because it's allowed, it's permitted. But if it's before the sprinkling, so the Kohanim are not allowed to eat it. And so it's still subject to Meilah. So we're going to see a few different things over here. Basar kadshei kadshim shayatza lifnei zrikas damim. So our scenario is, our case is, meat of a high-level sacrifice, which was taken outside of the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash before they had a chance to sprinkle it. So let's have a look at what we are going to be seeing in a machlokes, in a argument. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Mo'alin bo. It is going to be subject to Meilah. You didn't do Zrika yet. It wasn't going to be allowed to Kohen. It's now disqualified. It's still subject to Meilah. You can't misappropriate it. You can't use it. Right? Ve'ein chayavin alav mishum pigul nosav atameh. And it's also not going to be subject to the problems of pigul, which is a status that you can give to the korban if you had the wrong intention at the wrong time. That's going to make it pigul, forbidden to eat. Nosar, it's not going to be a violation of nosar if you eat it after the time when you would have been allowed to eat it. So once it becomes permitted to a kohen, they've got a certain amount of time that they can eat it. If it goes beyond that time, they should be violating the mitzvah of nosar, of leftovers. But it's not going to get to that point because you haven't done zrika, and then it became disqualified. And tameh, if it becomes contaminated before you did sprinkling, it never became permitted to a kohen. And so tameh is also going to be something which you're not going to be liable for if it got eaten. So Rabbi Eliezer says, once it gets taken outside, it's invalidated. It's not going to be a valid sacrifice anymore. And since a kohen is not going to be able to eat it at all, yeah, so that means that it's going to be subject to Meilah, but there's not going to be any violations of pigul, nosar, and tameh. That's the first opinion. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ein Mo'alin bo. It's not going to be subject to Meilah because Rabbi Akiva is going to tell us that it's going to be determined by the service. It's going to be determined by what does that mean? It's going to be determined. Why have I written that? That it's going to be determined by the service. So I think Rabbi Akiva would say that they should still go ahead and do the sprinkling, or that they could still go ahead and do the sprinkling, even though the animal might have been taken out of the Beis HaMikdash, out of the courtyard. So because the sprinkling could still be done according to Rabbi Akiva, right? So Meilah would be lifted. So there's not going to be a violation of Meilah. But counter to that then, aval chayav in alav mishum pigul no savatame. But these other things are going to be back in play. So if they go and leave it beyond its extended time, so he would say that it does qualify for nosar, for leftovers, etc., etc. And then he goes on to say, Amar Rabbi Akiva, I've got proof to this. V'harei hamafrish chataso. If a person was to have designated a korban chatat, right? This is going to be an example where you can't eat the korban, but it's still subject to these other mitzvot, these other potential violations. If a person designates a korban chatat, a sin offering, va'avdan, and he lost it, the hifrish acheres tachteha, and then he went and separated and designated another one, because he still has to bring the korban chatat, but he doesn't have access to the original. Va'achar kach nimtseis harishona, and then he goes and finds the first one. So now he's got two designated sin offerings. Right? He's got two animals standing in front of him. Lo kashem shedama poter es besara, kachu poter es besar chaverta. So with two animals standing in front of him, fit for sacrifice, he would say as follows: is it not the case that just as the blood of one animal is going to mean, if you sprinkle one animal, the meat is going to be valid for consumption. It's not going to be falling under the prohibition of Meilah, right? So it should also exempt the other animal. In which case, we're going to have a situation where you should So it's not the case. I think that's what he's saying. It's not the case. So sprinkling the blood of one, it's not going to be the case that they can eat the meat. And so too, oh, come on, this is so wordy. One second. Let's just back it up, guys. Back up. Right? You found both animals. So now you can choose either one of these animals to sacrifice. So according to Rabbi Akiva, if you kill both of the animals, you can only sprinkle blood from one of them, but you're going to lift the Meilah of the other one as well, right? Because at the time of sprinkling, they've both reached a point where they could both be theoretically eaten, okay? So if the first animal is going to lift the Meilah from the second animal as well, so then it should lift that completely. That's what we're trying to get to. Let's try that one again. So the blood of one animal is going to now lift the restrictions on its meat, and it's also going to lift the restrictions on the other animal. And if it's lifting the restriction on both animals of Meilah, then dinhu sheyiftoris basara. So it's going to lift the restrictions on the meat as well, which is why you're going to end up with a situation where it's going to be liable for pigul, nosar, and tameh, but it's going to have the restriction for Meilah lifted off of it. So that's what he would say. That his opinion was there's no Meilah on this animal, but it is going to be liable if it got eaten in a state of pigul, nosar, and tameh. Good. Mishnah Gimel. When it comes to the lighter sacrifices, it's not going to be the meat that's a problem for us. It's going to be the fats, because the fats are going to be offered up on the Mizbeach. So at the time of consecration, it's not going to be subject to Meilah. But once you've sprinkled the blood and those fats and things need to go onto the Mizbeach, now Meilah kicks into place. So the Mishnah says, Eimurei kadashim kalim. If you've got the fats of lower level sacrifices, sheyatzu lifnei zrikas adam, they were taken out of the courtyard before you had sprinkled the blood. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer ein mo'alin bahem. It's not going to be subject to Meilah because you haven't sprinkled the dam yet. So the fats don't have to go up onto the altar yet. Ve'ein chayavin aleihem mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. And it's also not going to create liability if it was consumed in a way that it would violate these three things: pigul, nosar, and tameh. Rabbi Akiva Omer, mo'alin bahen. It is going to be effective. If the sprinkling happens, it's going to now mean that the fats are subject to Meilah, mo'alin bahem, v'chayavin aleihem, mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. So all of these liabilities, all of these obligations are going to kick into effect according to Rabbi Akiva. And finally, for chapter 1, Mishnah Daled, Ma'aseh damim b'kodshe kodshim lahakel ulahachamir. The act of sprinkling the dam is going to create an angle of leniency and an angle of stringency for high-level sacrifices. With a kodshim kalim kulan lahachmir, and we're going to see with the lower level, it's going to create completely stringent halachot situations. Ketzad, what is Rabbi Nick talking about? So the Mishnah says, Kodshe kodshim lifnei zrikas damim. If you've got a high-level sacrifice before you've sprinkled the blood, so as we said earlier, mo'alin, it's still going to be subject to Meilah, but a murin uvabasar, the limbs and the flesh are all going to be subject to Meilah if it's before the sprinkling. La'achar zrikas damim, after the sprinkling of the blood, at which point the limbs go up on the altar and the meat goes to the Kohanim. So the Mishnah says, mo'alim ba'emurim, the limbs are going to be subject to Meilah because they've still got to be processed on the altar. Ve'ein mo'alin babasar, but the flesh, which is going to the Kohanim, won't be subject to Meilah. Alzeh va'alzeh, but on both of these stages, chayavim mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. The person can be violating the prohibitions of pigul, nosar, and tameh. Uvakodshim kalim, with lower level sacrifices, kulan lahachmir, it's strict across the board. Asks the Mishnah, Ketzad, what are you talking about, Rabbi Nick? Answers the Mishnah, Kodshim kalim lifnei zrikas damim. If it's before the sprinkling, ein mo'alin, lo ba'emurim, v'lo ba'basar. So there's not going to be Meilah on the limbs or on the flesh. La'achar zrikas damim, but after the sprinkling of the blood, mo'alin ba'emurim, the limbs are going to be subject to Meilah. Ve'ein mo'alin ba'basar, and the meat which is going to go to the owner is not going to be subject to Meilah. Alzeh va'alzeh, but at both stages of the process, I don't know where we are in the English. Alzeh va'alzeh, chayavin mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. So they're going to still be liable for pigul, nosar, and tameh. So the Mishnah says, nimtza, we see what emerges out of this is Maaseh damim b'kodshe kodshim lahakel ulahachmir, that sprinkling of the blood of higher level sacrifices is going to result in aspects of stringency and aspects of leniency. Uvakodshim kalim kulo lahachmir, but with the lower level sacrifices, all of their aspects are going to end up in a position of paskening stringently, paskening lechumra. Mazel tov, ladies and gentlemen, on completing chapter 1. And let's jump into chapter 2. Let's see how we do. Maybe we'll leave time for chapter 3. So we're going to be going through lists of all of the different types of sacrifices and discussing when Meilah is going to start and finish. And there'll be some other things that we look at as well. So we're going to start with Chatas Ha'of, which is the bird offering given for a particular sin, for a particular Aveira. So that is a high-level sacrifice, even though it's a bird. But if you remember, right, the process of killing the bird is different than an animal. With an animal, we do shechita with a knife. For a bird, we do something called malika, which is where the Kohen takes an extremely sharp fingernail and severs the throat of the bird with his finger. So that's the equivalent to shechita, but we don't do shechita on the bird when we're killing it for a sacrifice. So the Mishnah says, Chatas ha'of mo'alin ma mishot dasha. So it's going to be subject to Meilah from the moment that it gets designated as a sacrifice. Nimlaka, but if you do the Malika process with your fingernail, right, which is the equivalent of shechita, so the Mishnah says, Huchshara lehipasel b'tvul yom uvemechusa kippurim uvalina. So it's going to be now in a position where it could be it could be disqualified if it touches somebody who still hasn't finished his purification process. So he has gone to the mikveh, but he hasn't yet waited for sunset, and then he's touched this bird after it's been killed, or it's someone b'mechusa kippurim. He was impure. He's waiting for the next day to be fully tahor, uvalina, or the bird was left overnight. So it could be problematic touching these birds or touching these people in these different stages. So once it's had its malika done, which is the equivalent of shechita, it could now be disqualified because of one of these things. But huzadamar, once you've sprinkled it, so that's the part of the process that is supposed to happen. Chayavin aleha mishum pigul no savatame. So a person could be liable. They could get the punishment of karet if they violate pigul no sarantame. Ve'ein ba me'ilah. But after the sprinkling of the dam, after the sprinkling of the blood, it's now going to have its me'ilah status lifted. You're not going to be violating me'ilah if it gets misused. Because after the blood is sprinkled, it's permitted to the Kohanim and it's not singularly consecrated to God and to the temple. Mishnah base. Ola sa'of. Another level here. This is a burnt up offering, which is also a bird. So mo'alin ba mishok dasha. From the moment that it gets designated to the base of mikdash as a sacrifice, it's going to be subject to me'ilah. Nimlaka huchshara li pasel b'tvul yom v'bechusa kippurim avalina. Once you've done the severing of the throat, so it's now going to be susceptible to disqualification through one of those different stages of people that it can't come into contact with, or by leaving the blood overnight. Mitzah dama. But now if you've done mitzah, which is not where it gets sprinkled, but it just kind of gets mashed up against the side of the mizbeach. You smash the bird up against the side and kind of squeeze the blood, almost like a sponge. Yeah, I hope you guys have had dinner tonight. So if you've done that part of the process, so now it's going to be permitted to be burnt up completely. So the Mishnah says, Chayavin aleh mishum pigul no savatame. So now it could be subject to pigul no sarantame, but umo'alin ba, it could still subject to me'ilah because it's still got to be burnt up on the altar. So ad sheteitze leveis hadeshen, until it's been completely burnt up and its ashes have been taken outside to the big ash pile outside of the courtyard. So all of that time now, it could still be subject to me'ilah. Mishnah Gimel. Parim hanisrafin. If it is a bull which is going to be burnt up, useirim hanisrafin, or it's a goat which is going to be burnt up. So these are sacrifices where nothing's going to get eaten. Yeah. These are things that are not going to get eaten. So mo'alin bahem mishuk dashu, they're going to be subject to me'ilah once they're designated. Nishchatu, once they get slaughtered, huchshuru li pasel b'tvul yom uvemechusa kippurim uvalina. So now they could be disqualified if they come into contact with a tavul yom, someone who's waiting for sunset before being completely purified. Uvemechusa kippurim, he's waiting till the following morning before he's completely sorted out. uvalina, or the blood has been left overnight. So it's going to be susceptible to those potential pitfalls. Huzadaman, if they've sprinkled the blood on the altar, chayavin alei mishum pigul nosav atame, then it's going to be subject to those three potential violations. And umolin bahem b'beis hadeshen al sheyutach habasar, and it's going to be subject to Meilah the whole time, even when it gets taken out of the azara after it's been burnt up on the altar. Even then, it's going to be subject to Meilah. These things are never going to be allowed to be used or to be misappropriated. Mishnah Daled, Ola, Ha'olah. If you've got a sacrifice which is going to be completely burnt up, Mo'alin ba mishukdasha, so it's subject to Meilah from the time that it gets designated. Nishchata, once it gets slaughtered, Huchsharali pasel b'tavul yom v'mechusa kippurim uvalina, then it's going to be subject to those three pitfalls. If it comes into contact with someone who's going to be pure after the night, someone who's going to be pure the following morning, if the blood gets left overnight, then there's going to be a problem. So it's subject to all those things. Shchita activates all of these things. Nizrak dama, once you sprinkled the blood, then that's going to activate it's going to activate those three violations. Ve'ein mo'alin ba'ora. So with the korban ola, the flesh and everything is going to get burnt up, but the skin is going to get given to the kohanim, and that's only after the blood gets sprinkled. So once the blood gets sprinkled, the hides, the skins, won't be subject to Meilah because they're going to be given to the kohanim. Aval mo'alin babasar ashayetze leveis hadashen, but the meat is going to be subject to Meilah the whole time until it gets taken out after it's been burnt up and removed from the altar and taken outside to the big ash pile. It can be subject to Meilah until that point. Mishnah hey chatas va'asham v'zivchei shalmei tzibur. So these are sacrifices where the flesh is going to be eaten by kohanim, right? Even though they're high-level sacrifices, they're going to end up in the hands of the kohanim, and so they are going to lose their Meilah status after the blood gets sprinkled. So we've got chatas, which is a sin offering. We've got asham, which is a guilt offering, a shame offering. And we've got the shalmei tzibur. We've got the shlamim, peace offerings that are the community peace offerings, public peace offerings. Mo'alin bahem mishukdashu. They're going to be subject to Meilah from the time that they get designated. Nishchatu, if they get slaughtered, that's going to activate Huchsharu li pasel b'tavul yom v'mechusa kippurim uvalina. That's going to activate the potential for disqualification if it comes into contact with those types of people, or if the blood gets left overnight. Nizrak daman, and if the blood gets sprinkled, that activates pigul nosav atame. Chayavin alei mishum pigul nosav atame. But the Mishnah says, ein mo'alin babasar, but it's not going to be subject to Meilah for the flesh, because the flesh is going to be given to different people. Aval mo'alin be'emurim ashiyetzu leveis hadashen. But the limbs, sorry, is that, no, the fats, surely. No, the limbs, yeah, the portions that are going to be brought up onto the altar, those are subject to Meilah, because anything that is still linked and tied to the altar, to the sacrifice, to the temple, those things are going to be subject to Meilah until they've been burnt up and they've been removed and taken out to the Beis Hadeshen, to the big ash pile outside of the Azara. Mishnah Vav, we move on to talking about Shtei Halechem, the two loaves of bread that get brought on Shavuot. So these are still high-level things, but they don't have any blood, because we're talking about bread now. So Shtei Halechem, Mo'alin Bahem Mishukdashu. They get subject to Meilah from the time that they get consecrated. But Karmu Batanur, once they start to cook, bake in the oven, and the crust starts to form. So now these are viable as loaves of bread to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash. So it's the equivalent of shechita, so to speak. There's a threshold at which things get activated. Shechita activates things for a korban. Malika activates things for a bird. The crust starting to form on a loaf of bread in the oven, that is the activation point for the 2 loaves of bread. These things are now going to be susceptible to being disqualified if they come into contact with a tevul yom or a mechusa kippurim. And they can now be used as loaves of bread to accompany a sacrifice. Nizrak daman shel kvasim. If blood gets sprinkled of a lamb where there's also loaves of bread being brought along with it, chayavin aleihem mishum pigul nosa v'tameh ve'ein bahen me'ilah. So if they now get activated by the zrika, they can now be consumed. So they're going to be liable to pigul nosa and tameh, but they're not going to be subject to me'ilah because they can now be given to the right people for eating. Mishnah Zion. Lechem hapanim, 12 loaves of bread that were brought every single week in the Beis Hamikdash. So there's no korban per se. Yeah. So mo'alin bahem mishokdashu, they get subject to me'ilah from the moment that they get consecrated. Karmu batanur, once I'm in the wrong place. Now I'm in the right place. Karam batanur, once the crust starts to form, they can be susceptible to disqualification if they come into contact with a tevul yom or a mechusa kippurim, ulehisader al gabe hashulchan, and they are now also eligible, fit to be arranged in the racks, in the shelves that get put on the golden table in the Beis Hamikdash. Karvu habazichim, if the frankincense get offered up, then that's kind of like the next activation point when it comes to the lechem hapanim. So that's the equivalent, as it were, of shechita. So once that gets activated, chayavin alav mishum pigul. Sorry, it's probably the equivalent of sprinkling. Chayavin alav mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. So now they're going to be subject to pigul nosar and tameh ve'ein bahen me'ilah. But now these loaves of bread would be passed around, and so they're not going to be subject to me'ilah. The kohanim would be allowed to eat them after the frankincense gets offered up, and so they're not going to be subject to me'ilah. Mishnah Ches, menachos, the regular flour offerings that don't have any counterpart, any sacrifice counterpart. So we're going lower and lower as each thing goes. Mo'alin bahem mishuk dushu, they are subject to me'ilah from the moment they are designated. Kadshu bakeli, once they get put into a temple vessel, right, the flour, the oil, whatever's getting mixed in, once they get put into a temple vessel for service, for use, so that's the activation point. So now they can be disqualified if they come into contact with a tevul yom, with a mechusa kippurim, or if they get left overnight. Karav hakometz, right? If the kohen has taken out the fistful of flour and then done what he needs to do to offer that up, which is the equivalent to sprinkling the blood, that activates chayavin alav mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. So that's going to make them liable for pigul, nosar, and tameh. Ve'ein mo'alin b'shirayim, but the leftovers, because nothing's going to be used now for the temple, it's all going to go to the kohanim. So the leftovers are not going to be subject to me'ilah. Aval mo'alim b'kometz, but that fistful is going to be subject to me'ilah until it's been burnt up and until it's been removed from the altar and taken outside to the big ash pile, because it's retained that connection to the altar. Mishnah Tes, Mishnah 9. So things which get burnt in their entirety are usually things which allow the next part of a process to take place. So we say, the things which activate different things. So that would be known as matir. It's something that is matir. It permits the next stage. It permits something to happen. So the Mishnah now is going to be talking about all of these different things which are matir, which unlock the next stage, which permit the next stage. So hakomets, the fistful from a mincha, which no one's going to have a share on it. That's going to stay.
No, I can hear you, but you...
Yeah, you can, but StreamYard can't. Oh, man. Oh, what's gone on? You can't see me still, can you? I've frozen, haven't I? Oh, that's so annoying.
We can hear you.
Oh, gosh, I'm going to have to teach all of this again on YouTube. Okay, so be it. So, so where were we? So anything that doesn't have any other stage required, right, like the things that we saw in this Mishnah, all of those things are going to be, what are they going to be? The kol she'ein lo matir, anything that doesn't have these permitted, as soon as they go into a temple vessel, they're going to be chayev for nosar and tameh, but pigul ein bo. Pigul is not going to apply. Pigul only applies to something that has these permissive unlocking elements to them. So that's so strange. So the words you can still see, but the camera for some reason is frozen. All right. If I can just do this quickly. Where you can't see me at all now, can you? All right, I don't know. Okay, never mind. You'll just have to hear me but not see me. Time is 6:48. Do we want to go for a third chapter?
Feel cool. I'm all right till 7:15. That's up to you.
Yeah. Jeff, have you lost the will to live yet?
No. Yeah, well, kind of. Yes, kind of. You keep going.
Keep going. All right. So we move into chapter 3. Move into Perek Gimel. Mazel tov on completing Perek Base, and we're going to be dealing with invalid sacrifices. So, I've lost the words now. There we go. So, we've got 5 types of sin offerings that are going to have to be killed because of different reasons, if I'm not mistaken. So, says the Mishnah, Vlad Chatas, you've got the offspring of a Chatas, of a sin offering, which is obviously going to be female. Utmurat Chatas, you've got the substituted sin offering. So, if we remember Maseches Tamura, then we'll hopefully remember this concept of substituted sacrifices. V'chatas shemesu ba'aleha, and you've got a sin offering where the owner has died, so it can no longer be brought in that person's name. There's no way to redeem it. There's no way to continue the process. So the Mishnah says yamusu, so they have to die. The animals have to be left to die. Sha'avra shanasa, if it's a sacrifice which is too old, right? It's gone past the year that it's permitted to be sacrificed in. V'she'avda v'shenimtseis balas mum, or it got lost, and when it was found, it was blemished. Im mishakipru habalin, if these things are happening after the owner has already got his atonement, right? Because he's brought a different sacrifice. So then tamus, they have to be left to die. Ve'ena osar tamura, they're not going to be subject to this mitzvah of this concept of tamura. V'lo nehenim, you're not allowed to have any benefit from it. V'lo mo'alim, but it's not going to be subject to Meilah because it's not considered a korban. It's not considered belonging to the Beis HaMikdash, so it's not going to be subject to Meilah. Vim ad shelo kipru habalin. But if the owners have not yet had their atonement, they've not yet brought an alternative, they've not yet brought whatever it might be, tireh ad shetistayev. So then you need to leave it to graze in the field until it becomes blemished. V'timacher, and then you can take it to the market and you can sell that animal. V'yavi b'dameh ha'acheres, and you can use the money to bring another korban. Va'osa tamura, and that could be subject to tamura as a substitute. Umo'alim ba, and before you've sold it, it can be subject to Meilah as well, because of the fact that it still maintains this connection to the Beis HaMikdash. Mishnah base, talking about a korban nazir. So in this case, he's designated money for his sacrifices, but he hasn't designated the actual animals. So money isn't subject to Meilah just on account of it being consecrated. So the Mishnah says, Hamafrish ma'os lenaziruso, person who designates money for the 3 sacrifices, the sin offering, the olah offering, and the shlamim offering, the peace offering. So he's going to have to bring 3 sacrifices, and he's set aside money, which is going to go towards these things. So lo nehenin, he can't benefit from this money for anything else, but v'lo mo'alin. But it's also not going to be subject to Meilah. Mipnei shehein, because money is not going to be subject to Meilah. Says the Mishnah, Mipnei shehein re'uyin lavo chulan shlamim, because at this point, all of the money could go towards any type of sacrifice. It could all go towards one shlamim. There's no way of specifically linking that money to the Beis HaMikdash because you don't know what it's going to end up on yet. So it's not subject to Meilah. Mace, says the Mishnah, if this Nazir dies and this money is unspent, Hayu Susumim, if the money is currently unspecified, it wasn't going to a particular animal, Yiplu Linadava, so this money now can go to voluntary sacrifices. Hayu Mefarashim, if it was specific that it was going to be used on a particular animal or a particular type of sacrifice, so it's going to depend. Dumei Chatas, if it was money to go towards a korban Chatas, Yelchu Liyam HaMelach, and you have to throw it into the Dead Sea, meaning you have to dispose of it in a way where no one is going to ever be able to potentially access this money. So it gets cast away. Lo ne'enim v'lo ma'alin bahem. It's not going to be allowed to have any benefit from, any pleasure, and it's not going to be subject to Meilah because it's money. To make Ola, if it was money which he was planning to spend on the Korban Ola, so Yaviu Ola, so then you can use that money to bring an Ola, any Ola, Umoalin Bahen, and that is going to be subject to Meilah, the Korban will be. To make Shlamim, if it was money that was going to go towards a peace offering, Yaviu Shlamim, so then we can go ahead and we can bring a different Shlamim. V'ne'echalim liyom echad, and the sacrifice is going to be eaten for one day and one night, rather than potentially 2 days and 2 nights for a Nazir. So it will get eaten in a level of shlamim where it would only be eaten over one day. It's not going to require loaves of bread to be brought with it, which otherwise would have happened with a Nazir. So it's going to be brought as a shlamim, but it's not going to be brought as a shlamim of a Nazir, because that Nazir is now no longer able to bring the sacrifice. Mishnah Gimel! Mishnah Gimel, we are going to see that there's no Meilah for blood, I think. Let's have a look. Rabbi Yishmael Omer. That's interesting. The translation says Rabbi Shimon, but the Hebrew says Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Hadam. When it comes to the blood, Kal betchilasa v'chamor b'sofa. It's going to have lenient halachas with regards to its status at the beginning, and it's going to get stricter at the end. With nesachim, with the libations, the wine that gets poured, that accompanies a korban, chomer betchilasam v'kal b'sofan. It's going to be strict in the halachas that apply to it at the beginning of the process, and it's going to be more lenient by the end of the process. So the Mishnah says, Hadam, but chila ein mo'alin bo. At the beginning of a sacrifice, when you've got the blood, it's not going to be subject to Meilah. Yatzal anachal kidron, once it gets poured out, the remainder of the blood gets poured out into a drain that's going to take it out to the Kidron Valley at the bottom of the Temple Mount. So there, the Mishnah says, Mo'alin bo. It can be subject to Meilah if it gets misused after that point. With Nesachim, with the libations, the wine that gets poured at the altar, but Chila Mo'alin bahen, at the beginning it's going to be subject to Meilah because it's part of the sacrificial process. Yatsu Lashisim, but once you poured it into the pipes or whatever at the top of the altar, now it's come down to the trough that runs through the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. It goes under the courtyard. So once it's gone down the drain, ein mo'alin bahem. It's not going to be subject to Meilah anymore. Mishnah Dalet. Dishon, the ashes that get cleared out. So different things here. Dishon mizbeach hapanimi v'hamanora. Ashes which get cleared away from the inner altar, the golden altar on the inside, and the menorah. These ashes, lo nehenin v'lo mo'alin. They may not give you any pleasure. You can't use them for any advantage for yourself. But lo mo'alin, they're not going to be subject to Meilah. Hamakdish dishin batchila. But if someone had removed this ash and then designated it, consecrated it for the Beis Hamikdash, then mo'alin bo, then it is going to be subject to Meilah. Torin shelo higi azmana. If you've got birds which have not yet reached their required age, so you've got doves who are not old enough yet, or you've got pigeons which are too old. So there's a time period where they're going to be too young for service or too old for service. Says the Mishnah, lo nehelin v'lo ma'alin. So then you are not allowed to have any benefit from them, any pleasure. V'lo mo'alin. But you're also not going to be, they're also not going to be subject to Meilah. So they have no value to the temple coffers, and so they're not going to be subject to Meilah. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Torin shelo hegiyaz manan, if it is a dove which is not old enough yet, mo'alin bahen, then it is going to be subject to Meilah, because Rabbi Shimon says there is going to be a point at which it is subject to Meilah. Once it hits the right age, it will be subject to Meilah. And so because of that, he is going to say that it can already be subject to Meilah at that point. I've just worked out how to get my camera back. Let's get rid of that face, put that face there. To all those watching on YouTube, welcome back to my face. So, where were we? So, Daled. Yeah, so Rabbi Shimon says if it's going to reach a point where it will eventually be the right age, so Meilah is still going to apply. But because these pigeons are too old, you can't get any benefit from it, like we said before, but also it's not going to be subject to Meilah, like we said before. Mishnah, hey. Blitzing through chapter 3 here. There is a difference between something consecrated for the Mizbeach and something consecrated just for the temple coffers. So if it's designated to the altar, if it's something that's going to end up on the altar, so it's subject to Meilah from the start, and after Zrika, we said then it's going to depend which things are going where. If it's something that's going to be designated actually to the temple, for use in the temple, for maintaining the temple, whatever it might be, so that is going to be entirely subject to Meilah. So the whole value of this thing is going to be consecrated. Okay, Mishnah Hey, Chalev Hamukdashin. If you have milk of sacrificial animals, Uveitse Torin, or the eggs of birds, which are designated to the Beis HaMikdash, consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash, Lo Nehenin Velo Mo'alin. You can't have any benefit from them, and they won't be subject to Meilah. Bamed Dvarim Amurim. What are we talking about, Rabbi Nick? Bekodshe Mizbeach, things which are consecrated for the altar. So I feel like I've just completely contradicted myself. So you've got this milk and you've got these eggs of animals that have been consecrated for the altar. So because these animals are going to be taken to the altar, their eggs and their milk, which won't be brought to the altar, are nonetheless going to be forbidden for benefit, but they're also not going to be subject to Meilah. But if you had consecrated an animal to the temple, for the temple upkeep, hiktish tarnagola, so you consecrate a hen, so there mo'alin ba, it is going to be subject to Meilah, uva beit sasa, and also its eggs are going to be liable, subject to Meilah, because the whole entity gets donated to the Beis HaMikdash. Chamor, if you're consecrating a donkey to the Beis HaMikdash, mo'alin ba, it's going to be subject to Meilah, and its milk is also going to be subject to Meilah, because, as we said, the whole entity gets donated and consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash. Mishnah Vav, that's talking about something which you donate to the Beis HaMikdash, but it's going to then be sold, and the money is going to be used for the Beis HaMikdash. So we're not using donkeys in the Beis HaMikdash, we're not using milk, we're not using eggs, but these things can be sold, and the money will be used for the Beis HaMikdash. So kol hara'ui. So 1 second. Let's just backtrack a little bit. So we said in the last mission that we've got eggs and milk and animals and all these kinds of things, and if they get consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash, anything that comes from them is also going to be consecrated. But is that the case? And is going to be subject to Meilah. But is that going to be the case across the board? What if you've got other things which haven't yet produced what they were intended for? So the Mishnah says, "Kol hara'ui lamizbeach v'lo lebedek habayis." Anything that was fit for sacrifice and not for upkeep of the temple maintenance, lebedek habayis v'lo lamizbeach, or something which is fit for temple maintenance but not for the altar, lo lamizbeach v'lo lebedek habayis, something which is not going to be used on the mizbeach and it's not going to be used to maintain the temple either. It's going to be just sold and the money is going to be used. Mo'alim bo, it's subject to Meilah. Ketzad, please explain. Hikdish bor malei mayim, a person consecrates a pit full of water. Ashba malei zevel, or they donate a huge pile of manure. Shovach malei yonim, or a dovecot which is full of pigeons. Ilan malei peros, a tree which is full of fruit. Sadem le'ar savin, a field which is full of grass. So they donate these things to the Beis Hamikdash. Mo'alin bahem uvamasha b'soichan. So all of these things are going to be subject to Meilah, and everything that's inside them is going to be subject to Meilah. The whole value gets donated to the Beis Hamikdash. Aval, however, im hikdish bor, if you just donate, if you just consecrate the pit, va'achar kach nismalei mayim, and afterwards you're filling up the water. So when you consecrated it, there was no water there. Ashpa va'achar kach nismal zevel, you consecrate the Allen Lane Recycling Center, but afterwards you start to fill it with the junk. Shovach va'achar kach nismalei yonim, you donate the dovecote, and afterwards the birds come into it. Ilan va'achar kach nismalei peros, you consecrate a tree, and afterwards the fruit start to arrive. Sadeh va'achar kach nismala asavim, you donate a field, and afterwards the grass starts to fill the field. Mo'alin b'hem, they're going to be subject to Meilah. Ve'ein mo'alin b'mash b'soicham divrei Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yehuda says that which was not present at the time of consecration, anything which had not yet developed, is not going to be subject to Meilah. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Hamakdish sadeh ve'ilan, if you consecrate a field or a tree, mo'alin b'hem v'geduleihem, then anything which is there and anything which is still yet to be there, the offshoots, the things which are going to grow, they are all subject to Meilah, mipnei shehen gidulei hekdesh, because they are all gidulei hekdesh. Anything which is going to be growing is going to be growing sanctified to the Beis Hamikdash. So that is Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Anything that is going to be developing, anything that's going to be growing through that item, so the field and the tree, you're not putting the fruit there. The tree is putting the fruit there. So those things are going to be subject to Meilah. But presumably then, if you're filling the water or if you are filling the manure, those things are not going to be subject to Meilah. What if you've got something which is automatically consecrated to the Beis Hamikdash? So Vlad Meuseres, you've got a tithed animal which has a child. Yeah, so there's such a thing as Maaseh Behema, that every 10th animal is going to be consecrated to the Beis Hamikdash. If that animal has offspring, lo yinak min ha'meuseres, so it's not going to be able to suckle from the sacrificial animal. Va'acherim misnadvim kain, but others, what's the others? So it's possible to, when you donate, when you consecrate this tithed animal, it's possible to say, yeah, but I don't mean the milk. And if you intend for the milk to not be included, then offspring can suckle. Hapoalim lo yochlu migrogros shel hekdesh. Workers are not allowed to eat from grogros, which are dried figs, if they're designated to the Beis Hamikdash. So normally when you're harvesting, you're allowed to take the odd thing here and there. It's not going to be considered theft. But if it's designated to the Beis Hamikdash, they're not going to be allowed to do that. In a similar vein, if you've got a cow or an animal that's working for you, so it's going to be allowed to graze a little bit here and there. It's not going to be a problem. But if it's already designated to the Beis Hamikdash, then it's not going to be allowed to eat from these things while it's working. Mishnah Zion, if you've got two fields side by side, where one of them is owned by you and one of them is owned by the Beis Hamikdash, and they share some roots, so what's going to be the story there with misappropriating, with Meilah, with things which are designated to the Beis Hamikdash? You're allowed to benefit from it, you're allowed to have any pleasure from it. So the Mishnah says, Sharshe Ilan Shel Hedya. If you've got the roots of a tree belonging to a normal, regular owner, Ba'in B'Shel Hekdesh, and it's infringing into the, it's getting a bit mingled up with areas of land that are consecrated to the Beis Hamikdash, or vice versa. B'Shel Hekdesh, Ba'in B'Shel Hedya. You've got a tree of Hekdesh, which is drawing from your field. Lo nehelin v'lo mo'alin. So you're not allowed to have any benefit from these things, but it's also not going to be subject to Meilah. Hama'ayan shehu yotzei mitoch sedei hekdesh. You've got a spring of water, you've got a water source that is going to be flowing from a field which is belonging to the temple, and it's coming into your field. Lo nehelin v'lo mo'alin. So you're not allowed to benefit from it, but it's also not going to be subject to Meilah. Yatsa chutz lasadeh, but once it goes out of the field, then nehenin mimenu, then you are going to be allowed to benefit from it. Hamayim shebekad shel zahav. If you have got water which is in a golden temple vessel. So what are we talking? Not temple vessel. Sorry, in a golden vessel. What are we talking about? We are talking about a very specific case. We're talking about water which is going to be used on Sukkos in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, water which would be drawn for temple service would be drawn in a golden jug. So the water that has been drawn for Sukkos in a golden jug, lo nehenin v'lo ma'alin. It's not, you can't derive any benefit from it, but it's also not going to be subject to Meilah, meaning that if you did derive pleasure from it, it's not going to be violating Meilah. Next, nasnu batzlochis, but once it's put into the flask, the flask that it's going to be used in the Beis Hamikdash with. So the golden jug is just the way that we're filling up. But once it's put into the active service vessel for use in the Beis Hamikdash, mo'alin bahen. That is when it would be subject to Meilah if you benefited from it, which you weren't allowed to do. Arava, when it comes to the willow branches that were placed on the side of the Mizbeach during Sukkot, lo nehenin v'lo mo'alin. So you can't benefit from it, but it's also not going to be subject to Meilah if you did benefit from it. Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Tzadok Omer, he says, Nosnin hayu mimena zakenin belul veihem. The sages, the elders, were accustomed to putting these willow branches into their lulav and using it for the mitzvah. So there's the evidence that it's not going to be a violation of Meilah. Mishnah Ches, and it's also not benefit because it's not their personal benefit, it's for a mitzvah. Finally, Mishnah Ches, you have got two types of trees. Guys, can you please be quiet? You've got two types of trees, and there's a nest on the top of these trees. So one of these trees is a tree for Hekdesh. One of these trees is a tree of Asherah, which I think is insinuating that it's for Avodah Zarah. So you're not allowed to benefit from Avodah Zarah, and you're not allowed to benefit from a tree which is designated for the temple. But where is a nest going to come into play? So the Mishnah says, Kain, Shebarosha Ilan Shel Hekdesh. If there's a bird's nest atop a tree belonging to the Beis Hamikdash, lo nehenin v'lo mo'alin. You can't derive benefit from it, and you're also not going to be violating Meilah if you did benefit. Sheba Asherah, if you've got a nest on top of this Asherah tree, so then Yatiz Bakaneh. so you can poke it down. You can't climb up the tree because then you're going to benefit from it. You're not allowed to benefit from it, but you're allowed to poke it down so that you can enjoy, I guess, the birds or the eggs or whatever it is. Hamakdish es hachoresh, a person who consecrates a choresh, a whole field, mo'alin b'chulah. So all parts of the forest, including nests, are going to be subject to Meilah. Hagizbarim shelakchu es ha'etzim. If you've got a temple treasurer who collects up pieces of wood, or who buys logs for use in the Beis Hamikdash, right? It's going to be used to repair the Beis Hamikdash or whatever. So mo'alin ba'etzim. So those pieces of wood are going to be subject to Meilah. Ve'ein mo'alin lo b'shipui v'lo b'neviah. But the sawdust, when you're working with it, or the offcuts, so you're needing to do repairs to the Beis Hamikdash or using this wood to be able to do it. There's going to be sawdust that gets created. There's going to be the offcuts that get created. So all of those things, the Mishnah says, are not going to be subject to Meilah. Once you've got the wood that you need, that you want, that you've crafted, those things are still going to be subject to Meilah, but not the bits that you don't want. 7:15, guys, and with that we say Mazel Tov on completing chapter 3 of Maseches Meilah, bringing us ever closer to the end of Seder Kodshim. Who knows? Maybe we'll get another 3 done next time. We'll just have to wait and see. But in the meantime, we say Mazel Tov to you all. We'll see you next time on Mishnah Mastery. Thank you so much for joining us. Join us for the after party on Zoom. But in the meantime, have a